from a president, anyone in power in Washington that we've seen from Trump. And I think it's counterproductive. I think a number of things are happening. And let me back away from the battle space for a second and point out that oil has now reached $90 a barrel and continues to rise. And I predict it will hit $150 a barrel within the next 30 to 60 days and then rise further. Also, the bond yield on the 10-year bond is up to 4.7%. The reason that's important is all the people that work in the bond markets, Jeffrey Gundlach, I'm trying to think, Luke Groman, there are several out there will tell you that once we hit 5%, we can no longer service our debt. And we have to understand that that interest rate is not set by the Fed necessarily. The market sets it. What the market is saying is foreigners are not going to invest in us. The people that normally would buy our debt won't buy it. The reason I'm bringing all of this up is that we may reach a point where Mr. Besant, who is as important in all of this as, let us say, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs right now, Kane and Hegseth, will walk in and say, look, boss, we can't print any more money. That won't extricate us from this emergency. In other words, they will have moved in this shell game the problem too many different places, too many times, they can't go on anymore. So the first thing to understand is that this is a race between, on the one side, our rapid financial crisis spinning out of control and our economy plummeting, and this so-called war with Iran of air and missile power. And the question is, which one gives way first? And I think the air and missile power war could conceivably outlast the financial crisis. But the point is, once you hit the financial crisis, everything stops. So what we're seeing right now from Iran is a very methodical approach to targeting. And they're targeting the things they said they would. And they're going after the statelets. Great thing. And note that Kuwait in particular has been a very, very popular target for Iran. And I predict when this war ends, whenever it does, that Kuwait will cease to exist. It'll simply become part of Iraq, which is kind of interesting given that we fought a war to prevent that, did we not?
I was thinking that very thing, actually, yes.
And then
how ironic it was.
Stateless, you see the same thing. They're going after those things, but we also have the shaping operation, which is to prepare Israel for attack. Their assumption is that they'll have to go back and attack Israel because Israel's not going to sit there quietly. At some point, there will be another resumption of operations there. And I think it's very clear the Iranians want to systematically remove all the radars and all the anti-missile batteries and so forth. And the same thing is true up and down the coast, from across from Karg Island all the way down to Chabahar. So that, the opportunity, unfortunately, for some kind of land operation seems very real.
Well, as a matter of fact, that is starting to become more and more spoken. We had Professor Morandi on yesterday, who did not hesitate to say he thought that maybe not Iran per se, but the resistance fighters in Iraq could move on Kuwait. He said that openly. The Houthis in Saudi Arabia, in the southwestern corner of Saudi Arabia, could move in. And then here, this just in the last, I guess this was just last night, the resistance affairs experts, the rulers of Arab countries should know that Iran has no fear of conducting ground operations against them. I was looking this morning at some of the targets that have been hit overnight, and I've noticed that a lot more are being hit on border control points in Kuwait, which makes it look more and more like something's coming. The fact that they're talking about this openly on Iranian television, that seems to imply that there is serious possibility to that. Now, that would seem just out of the ordinary. Iran is just trying to hunker down and survive, but now there's actually talk that they may go on a ground offensive. Do they have that capability?
Yes, they have the capability to overwhelm not just Kuwait, but they could go after the other Emirates. Remember, the only thing that really stood between the various statelets in the Gulf and Iran for years was American military power. We essentially picked up the British mission. The British mission, after they created these little statelets, was to ensure that the oil states would be protected so that the oil would flow freely down to the Persian Gulf, up through the Suez, and then off to Europe and Great Britain. So that makes perfect sense, and the Arabs have demonstrated pretty conclusively. I'm talking about the people in the Arabian Peninsula and certainly in the Gulf, that they're not really capable of protecting themselves, or they're not willing to. And now we have this public discussion of a potential arrangement with Saudi Arabia to provide nuclear materials. I mean, this is just astonishing. It's almost as though we're not satisfied to come to some sort of arrangement with Iran. We want to blow the entire region up. And obviously, we've turned to the Kurds in the hopes of mobilizing them. And I think the Iranians have skillfully eliminated any platforms or bases in Iraq or Syria from which the Kurds could launch against Iran. And I know that the Turks have been helpful to the Iranians in that regard. They've helped them target the Kurds. Both the Turks and the Iranians share the same interest, suppressing the Kurds, preventing them from helping to tear the region apart.
Yeah, in fact, there's been a lot of bombing up in this quadrant here of late on the near Erbil and where a lot of the Kurdish areas are here, and also inside this territory as far, I think, even into Syria, but because Iran has been going after those. And I just wanted to go after here. This is the territory of Kuwait right here. And at least what Professor Morandi suggested, that there could potentially be some movement here in the south, and one wonders also from the southeast. What do you know about what capabilities Kuwait has to defend itself on the ground?
Nothing significant. I mean, they purchased some equipment from us. I don't know how much of it is operational. I don't know how resolute the people inside the Kuwaiti defense establishment are. And the other thing is that they've started hitting some of these desalination plants, or I guess desalination plants. I don't remember how many there are, 5, 6, 7, but you begin to destroy those. You have roughly 5 million people living there, depending upon these desalination plants. So it could end up being a situation where if they went in on the ground, and it would definitely come out of Iraq, there might not be much there to meet them.
And you know what? I was just thinking even about our time in that, our combat in that, not far from those locations there. And when I went back to Iraq in 2009, I think I did spend some time at Camp Bering in Kuwait, doing some training in not far from where that map I was just showing you. And I remember there are, unless something has happened that I'm not aware of, there were literally no defenses up to the north. This is not like the Russia-Ukraine war where there's all these intricate fortifications and trenches and whatever else. It's just wide open desert you can drive through. And what would be the military capacity of, let's say, I mean, we're just hypothetical speaking here. Let's say that these alleged 150,000 resistance fighters from Shia in Iraq, which are ostensibly part of the Iraqi security forces, so actually part of the state, if they broke away and said, no, we're going to move on here, if from what you know, how hard would that task be for Kuwait to defend?
I think it's almost impossible. I know that King Abdullah from Jordan is now in the United Kingdom somewhere. That may be an indication of where things are headed in Jordan in the near future. I would imagine that the al-Sabah family has packed its bags and headed to London or somewhere else. You know, all of these places in the Gulf are very weak. These are not strong, cohesive societies. They don't maintain effective military establishments. We were looking a few years ago at what the average private in the UAE ground force is paid. I think it was something like the equivalent of $80,000 a year, plus, you know, whatever benefits are involved with that. Can you imagine that? And are you expecting these people that spend half of their day lying around at home, relaxing, and only spend perhaps half a day on active duty? I just don't see that happening. I don't see them doing much of anything. Everything is dependent upon us.
You know, I also remember you and I were in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry in 1990. We were in Grafenwehr Training Center doing a lot of training and exercises against what we thought was going to be a potential Soviet foe when, on August the 2nd of 1990, Saddam Hussein did invade into Kuwait and rolled all the way through in basically a day and set up his forces on the southern side there. But at that time, we had a couple of divisions, and I think George Bush sent the 101st and maybe the 82nd. I can't remember exactly who it was, but light fighters basically to put a presence there. And then we all started and moved up, and we had, I think, somewhere around 750,000 in the Army at that time, and all of our forces could go from Germany at that time and deploy into the 7th Corps. We went in there. Does such a force exist now? If anyone, whether Iran and or Iraq forces do that, can we do a Desert Storm 2 type operation today?
Well, obviously not. We were lucky that Saddam Hussein, frankly, made the decision he did to effectively attack us. If it hadn't been for his decision to attack, I don't know that we'd have had much of an army, frankly, Dan, to fight with. If you recall, we had at the time almost 800,000 men in the United States Army. The Army was in a drawdown, and you had multiple divisions that had to be stripped out to bring the divisions we sent up to full strength. We weren't really ready, but the good news was that at least those of us who came from Europe were probably, I think, arguably in a higher state of training. But nevertheless, we were overtrained for the task, as you know, and we were very fortunate.
And what would happen if President Trump today was tempted to say, if an invasion happens, to say, I'm going to do my own Desert Storm and I'm going to move a bunch of troops over there? Can we do that?
No, first of all, we live in a new world today, and you could never build a lodgment unless you had enormous quantities of air and missile defense that you could surround the so-called lodgment area where you would collect and organize and assemble forces. And at the time, one of the things that we discussed privately was if we ever have to come back again in the future, given the direction of technology, we'd probably have to land at a place like Yanbu on the Red Sea and then cross the desert, because if we tried to get into the Persian Gulf, we would be sunk or attacked or killed pretty rapidly. A lot of people realized, I think more people realized the danger that would be presented in the future than we appreciate right now. Admiral Zabrowski certainly understood that, as did the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, whose name escapes me at the moment. But there were people that were thinking this through. But ultimately, Dan, I think the real lesson is this: even though there were smart people at the helm, nothing really changed inside the force.
And you talk about if we land in Yanbu, which is about right there on the map there, that would be 1,000 kilometers that we would have to travel just to get to the battle space area right there, as opposed to when you and I went in, we went to Al Jabail, which was right here. That would be literally impossible right now with all of the Iranian firepower that they have all up and down this coast, for us to try and disembark with ro-ro ships and container ships to get our tanks and whatever else off the board here just to drive up to Kuwait. That would be nearly impossible right now. In fact, it might be absolutely impossible. What do you think?
Completely, without question. No doubt about it. And, the tanks are still equipped with these turbine engines. And those things, as you know, drank fuel. And even though you have this auxiliary power unit that's supposed to reduce the amount of fuel that you consume, if you're moving, it doesn't make any difference how fast you move. You consume the gas at roughly, I think it was 8 hours, 7.5 to 8 hours, and you're on empty. That's 7 or 8 hours of operation. You can't fight a war that way. That's why the notion of committing these forces in a place like Ukraine is absurd. Ukraine is enormous. You'd go a couple of 100 miles and everybody's standing around waiting for tons of fuel to arrive. It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't, and in fact, it doesn't. Whether it makes sense or not, we just don't have that capability anymore. So if that happens, the whole system is so much more vulnerable than it was in 1991. It's remarkable how less capable we are today. And I don't think President Trump keeps saying, and Secretary Hegseth said 2 days ago, repeated, we're the most powerful military on the planet, and yet we couldn't even do a Desert Storm 2 because of our limited capability. That's the reality of it.
Well, Dan, you got what is it? An echo or something? You got an echo? Okay.
I don't hear an echo. I don't. If you do, I'm not sure about that.
Is that? I think this. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you fine. I have no problem hearing you.
Yeah, I think we have to understand that it's civilians in general, particularly people who are members of Congress. They're very impressed with glitz and glamour, shock and awe. You show them videotapes of explosions. They equate an explosion on the ground with an effect that is a war-winning effect. There's no understanding of how complex warfare is, and the need for multiple capabilities being employed and orchestrated as an integrated force. There's just no understanding of that at all. So everybody is in the hunt for a silver bullet. Everybody wants to buy the silver bullet that will win the war. And we're finding out that there are no silver bullets unless you want to go the nuclear route. And we should talk about that because I think that's being discussed too.
And, let's take a look there, Doug, because you say it's complex. Well, apparently for most in Washington, it's actually not complex at all. It's kind of easy. It's just about a bunch of cash. And here we have a $1.5 trillion defense budget was passed by the House, and that was a little bit deceptive. We're going to talk about what the internal parts of that are here shortly. But just looking at the top line number here, 1.15 trillion, but that's also in addition to 350 billion, of which it was just for semantics, so it didn't look as 1.5 trillion, going from 1 to 1.5 trillion, which is just astronomical. But Congress is really happy with that. And also turns out that money equals capability. And General Jack Keane says, you know what? Let's just go and use that force and finish the job.
We are on a definite path to return to major combat operations that would involve Israel and the United States. I think that is the path we're on. Is there some negotiations that the Iranians want to do here? Of course, they want to negotiate. Why now? They want to negotiate because they want to stop the United States from imposing their will by firing on them and taking away their military capabilities. They want to stop that, as they did successfully back on April the 7th and April the 8th. They want to replay that. I don't believe that's going to happen. Pakistanis and Qataris are supporting him on that, but I don't think that's where the president is and his team around him. I believe where they are frustrated, they want to get the Straits of Hormuz eventually open and also return to major combat operations and finish what they started out to do in terms of assigned military objectives.
So that's all we got to do, Doug. Just got to go and finish the job here. What say you?
Well, he said some very important things that the audience needs to note. First of all, he led off his discussion with Israel. Dan, this entire war is about Israel and the interest of its agents in the United States, its lobby, its supporters, the Zionist billionaires, whatever you want to call them. That's what this is about. This is not about the United States of America. Contrary to popular belief, Iran is not and never has been an existential threat to us. And if you go back and pick through all the series of supposedly horrific things the Iranians have done to us, they all shrink to insignificance next to the war that we encouraged Iraq to fight against Iran that cost Iranians somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 dead and perhaps 1 million casualties. Nobody brings it up. We set it up. We equipped Saddam Hussein. We sent him into action. This is long before we went after Saddam. And this is a big problem. This is not about our interests. We have no interest in attacking Iran. Remember, it was the attack on Iran by the United States and Israel that has caused the Gulf to be closed. It was open until we attacked. Now, suddenly, everything that we talked about in the past, the nuclear development and capability and bringing, Iran to the table, all this kind of nonsense, that's all taking a back seat to control of the Persian Gulf. That's where we are, and that's what we're focused on. And until that resolves itself, we're not going to move on to very much else. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not interested in destroying whatever infrastructure is out there that supports the One Belt, One Road. These are the Chinese rail lines and so forth, the connectivity to Russia, because Iran has a very important role to play in the One Belt, One Road that China has started. But having said that, this is really preeminently, first and foremost, about Israel. And Americans just have to get that through their heads because they ought to be asking why. And, you flashed across this defense bill. And in the new defense authorization bill, there is this integration of Israeli force, let's call it force development or technological development, and American technological development in a purely military context. And I think Larry Wilkerson said it best. I think it was early this morning or could have been yesterday afternoon. He said, what we're doing is that we're making what Pollard, the Israeli spy who ratted us out to all sorts of people, legal. In other words, what he did, for which he was sentenced to life imprisonment, is effectively being legitimated and legalized by this defense authorization bill. Americans ought to be very concerned about that. And I don't think most Americans even appreciate what it means.
Yeah, I'm very sure that a lot of them don't. I mean, that's many are starting to. Thomas Massey, of course, led the charge to try and from within to try to get this thing stripped out. He obviously failed because 100%, I believe it was nearly 100% of the Republicans were supportive of that bill in the House of Representatives, and about half of the Democrats were. So there's still an overwhelming number of people who were still subservient to whatever the Israeli side, no matter what they're talking about with the intelligence and the military tying together of the two sides. And I just wonder if you could just on a practical level, just talk about that for a second, because we have had, this claim that, we gain a lot from Israel. We have had other good allies too, since World War II, Great Britain, France, Japan, Germany, UK, obviously, and yet we have never even contemplated joining our militaries to them, no matter how good our relationship has been. Why? I mean, this is probably a loaded question, but why do you suppose we're talking about doing that with this tiny little country of Israel when we won't do that to our advantage, potentially, with any of these other allies?
Well, the other allies have not invested billions of dollars in the campaigns of members of the House and the Senate. In other words, people in the House and the Senate stand to benefit directly and indirectly from these arrangements. It's effectively, on one hand, they're benefiting because they get money from the Zionist billionaires representing the Israeli lobby. And they're also going to be rewarded for supporting the Israeli lobby in the form of kickbacks that are funneled back through their districts and states and so forth. So the financial dimension is unambiguous. It's very real. Again, we're just legislating and legitimating treason for all intents and purposes. We're saying this is all right. Now, why would they do that? Because most of them don't think it matters. They don't trace anything. They don't care about it. They need to understand the Israelis are certainly not above, and have done so in the past, selling our technology to the Chinese or the Russians or to any number of other people for the right price. So the Israelis are very, let us say, open-minded about any technology that they receive from us. We don't seem to care about that, but because we just don't think it matters. It won't have any impact on us. And they're wrong. And what we don't seem to understand is that technologies that were once a monopoly of American military power are now widespread and proliferating, in part because of Israel and other states. So this is not the time to be careless. But money has a special meaning. Greed is endless. Washington, I sometimes describe it as this enormous mountain-like feature that is entirely composed of cash. And people come here to dig into the mountain, fill up every wheelbarrow and bag they can with as much cash as possible before they quit and go home again.
Well, that's an interesting analogy. We're talking about all these mountains that we can't penetrate with missiles in Iran, and there's this cash mountain we also, regular people, can't penetrate either. We'll see where that goes. But you said people aren't talking about this. At least one person is talking about it a lot, and that is Tucker Carlson.
The entire House of Representatives, every Republican but 7 today, minutes ago, just voted to merge the U.S. military, the $1.5 trillion a year U.S. military, with the tiny reserve force, IDF. Does that help us? No, of course it helps them. Merge American intelligence, the 19 intel agencies, with Mossad. What? Of course. basically a humiliation ritual. Whatever you want, Israel. If it hurts us, that's fine. Actually, it feels good to sacrifice for you. It's like everyone in the entire government is Mike Huckabee now.
Wow, that last part there. Everyone's Mike. Hard to argue with that because Mike Huckabee on paper is the U.S. ambassador to Israel, but definitely he is the Israeli mouthpiece to America, no matter what his title is. Hard to argue with much Tucker said there.
No, I think Tucker's essentially correct. The difference, of course, is that Tucker has 24-hour-a-day security to protect him, and he needs it. That's how dangerous it is for him to speak publicly and say these things. That doesn't mean it isn't risky for others, but we don't have that kind of security. The interesting part is that none of this had to be this way. During World War II, we were very sensitive to the information, the intelligence, and the things that we gave to the British. In fact, sadly, FDR was much more ready to support the communists in the Soviet Union, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that was fighting the West. At that time, Hitler, and before Hitler, it was prepared to fight us as well, obviously. As a result, people subsequently, after World War II, when they discovered these things, I mean, they discovered, for instance, that in January of 1945, we shipped a very large portion of plutonium, enriched uranium, to the Soviet Union. This is something that FDR authorized through Harry Hopkins. People couldn't believe it, but it happened. It should never have happened, but he signed off on it. We did nothing like that for the British under any circumstances. So this is not the first time, but it's not going to be advantageous for us. It will redound to our disadvantage. And I just can't even begin to imagine how bad it can get. Right now, things are bad enough with this pointless, unnecessary war against Iran.
Well, and that's actually, I want to jump back to that because there are some continuing developments even today. We talked just a second ago that because of what has happened in the Bab el-Mandab and the Red Sea, that and the Houthi attack of a couple of ships yesterday caused the price to go back up to over $100 a barrel. That's the paper price, though. But let's show you the actual practical impact at the point. This is live right here. This is the spot price for oil. This is what, when anybody fills up a tanker and they buy a physical barrel of oil, not the paper, this is what it's trading at right now, $140 a barrel. And that's what has the impact on our our economy, because economic activity is based on the amount of energy you have. And so when you have to pay that much for energy, then the commensurate price of your economic output will also rise. It's not the $100 barrel, as bad as that is. It's $140, which can only go up. What concerns do you have about what impact that's going to have on our economy especially if Jack Keane's advice is taken there and we end up going back to full-scale operations?
Well, you're talking about the difference between the paper price and the real price, and it's very important, and you're right. I said earlier that it's going to go to $150 within the next 30 days or so. I'm talking about the gap between the two is going to narrow. One is going to catch up with the other. And when that catches up, it has a huge impact. Not only is no one interested in buying our debt at this point, and that's a big problem because that's part of the system that backs the petrodollar. In addition to that, we're going to see these treasury interest rates rise. When that 10-year hits 5%, all you have to do is run the numbers, run the math. We cannot service the debt. The debt, remember, is already as large as the defense budget. In other words, the payments, it's going to go well beyond that. I think there's something else, too, that people don't understand. When you have cheap energy, you also usually have cheap credit. Now, cheap credit means that you're paying very little for new money. Right now, that's drying up quickly. As your position weakens financially, the cheap credit dries up. When you can't get cheap credit, you can't afford real credit. My point is that could crash the entire economy. Our whole financial system could collapse. And in the meantime, remember that you have China, which is moving to gold-backed currency. They haven't announced it in those terms, but that's effectively where they're headed right now. That's why they opened the vaults in Riyadh and the vault in Hong Kong. And that's why they want to enable countries to pay for their oil and energy and anything else they want in gold. And everybody is now turning slowly but surely, consistently towards the yuan because it has value. What does that say about the dollar? They're de-dollarizing. They're walking away from the dollar because the dollar doesn't appear in their minds to have long-term stability in terms of value.
And all of this is going to be exacerbated because you're talking about these economic costs that are starting to manifest. Now it's not theoretical. It's starting to happen right before our eyes at the time that Jack Kenney is wanting to go down the path that caused all of these problems to rise up where we are. He wants to double down on those. Well, let's take a look at what that's going to mean, because first of all, the Strait of Hormuz, even though the United States Central Command lies every day in saying that the Strait of Hormuz is open, we have very practical, concrete evidence that that's a complete lie. No, hardly anything is traveling through the Hormuz, especially on our path here. More concerning, especially if we go back into these strikes here, is on our Patriot expenditures. So we see that the Iranian side, despite all of our vaunted Patriot and THAAD air defense systems, whatever, most of the shots are getting through, and they are precise hits by the Iranian side. Then when you look at those, this is really important here. This is going to tail into something you published recently. America is firing Patriot interceptors at more than 100 times faster than we can build them. 11 straight nights of American strikes, now 12. And Iranian missile drones still reach Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan. U.S. intelligence assessment reported by the Washington Post concluded that the bombing is unlikely to move Tehran at all. And then the underlying math is what matters. During the first 4 days of this war, coalition forces expended Patriot rounds at roughly 225 per day, while Lockheed's facility produces 1.7, consumption ratio of 132 to 1. And that immediately made me think of this piece that you've recently published on your Substack, Trump's War to the Last Missile. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about what that reveals based on some of the information we just posted?
Well, when I wrote this, I wrote it to get the point across to people that we could run out of missiles long before Iran does. In fact, we could end up not being able to provide any of our strategic partners or friends any missiles at all. We're already stripping out much of the world's missile inventories and shipping them to the Middle East. This is not going to end well for us. We're simply going to look impotent in the eyes of the world. And if you admit that your bombing strategy or your air and missile strategy isn't working, that you're not hitting the right targets, which is always the essence of the promise of success for air and missile campaigns, well, then it suggests that you're nearing the end of your inventory. And what do you do when you have no more missiles to fire? Harry Kazianis wrote a great piece where he tried to explain this. Now, when back in the early at 2001, 2, 3, and 4, before I left the Army, I must tell you that there were people in Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, who were making the argument in private that they cannot surge. Now, during World War II, everybody says, well, look what we did during World War II. Well, the government poured in billions of dollars to help somebody like Henry Ford build this mile-long assembly line so that we could turn out thousands of aircraft very, very rapidly. And they perfected it and they did it. We haven't had anything like that occur. In other words, there has been no focused investment to get the kind of surge capacity that you need if you fight. Now, the Russians realized they were in a difficult position back in 2022 when they moved into Ukraine and they discovered, my God, this force is much larger and more dangerous than even we thought. And then they captured the plans and saw that they wanted to use that force against them in a place like Crimea, not just in Donetsk, Luhansk, and so forth. So what did they do? They focused their investment, they focused their attention, their manpower, everything on the scientific industrial base so that they could rapidly turn out the weapons and the missiles they need. And, you know, Alex Vershinin has written about this, about the criticality of an industrial base if you're going to fight an industrial war. And we're involved in an industrial war. But what we lost sight of was that it's a war of missiles and unmanned systems, specifically these relatively inexpensive Shahad drones and others. That's a little different from what we anticipated. We have satellites. We can build a similar ISR strike capability, but we don't have the vast numbers of missiles and drones that we need. But we do have a lot of other things. Unfortunately, a lot of the other things that we have aren't terribly useful. So this is not news, but it's a reality that we have to deal with. The smart thing to have done when we realized we were in this position was to get out of this and go home and get back on the drawing board, re-examine what we were doing, what we would need. But we didn't do that. Instead, we're doubling down on failure. And so you're going to get a double failure. You're going to get failure militarily, strategically in the Persian Gulf against Iran, matched by strategic failure at home, financially, economically. I can't think of a worse set of circumstances for any great power in the history of mankind.
And you know, Doug, it's also that reality. All these things you just be talking about are clearly evident to the Iranian side, because they have discovered that they could weather everything that we could throw at them for 40 days. They could weather this blockade, and now they're kind of weathering a combination of both, and they're able to succeed and hit us through it. And that kind of leads to some confident statements from like their foreign minister Arakchi here, who says, listen, here's our current situation. This is as of yesterday afternoon. Any aggression against Iran, including our infrastructure, will compel a powerful and decisive response. Our defense doctrine is clear: an eye for an eye. Those who contribute to such aggression, whatever kind of support, will also be considered as legitimate targets. And of course, there he's talking about our regional allies. Now, when the Americans look at that, instead of coming to the conclusion you just did about, all right, all this stuff has failed, let's don't do that again. Let's do something different and reevaluate. Instead, Marco Rubio says, yeah, about his comments.
You know, guys, I saw Arachi, their foreign minister, who the other day say or something about their policies, an eye for an eye. The president's policy is a head for an eye. I mean, honestly, that's what it's going to be. I mean, they will pay a very heavy price for the things they're doing. They're already paying a very heavy price. You guys don't know it because you don't cover it. You're not in Iran. You're not in the street. They don't have a free media. But they're going to continue to pay a very heavy price. Their industrial base has been decimated. Their defense industrial base has been decimated. They're losing launchers. They're losing radars every single night. They are suffering billions of dollars in damage, and their economy is a disaster. But despite all that, okay, these people who are calling us every day, begging, let's do a deal, they send us messages through other countries, third countries. I mean, they're running out of countries to send. Even I had countries here coming up to me, oh, I just spoke to the Iranians, they want to do a deal. The problem is, every time these people do a deal, they either break it, or after they make it, they want to change the deal.
Yeah, Doug, I don't think there's hardly anything he said that's accurate or true there. What do you make of it?
Well, the first thing is that, as far as I can tell, no one in Iran is beating the drum for peace. I think if you look at the situation in Iran today, whatever opposition existed to the current regime is either suspended or vanished. The nation is united, and the political actors in the country are united in their opposition to any sort of arrangement with us that would end this war on any terms other than those that you saw in the 14 points. So those 14 points remain on the table. I don't see the Iranians backing off of that at all. So I think that's the first part. The second part is that if you have to tell the American people day after day after day after day that you are winning, and you argue, we've hit this many targets and we've destroyed this many buildings and so forth, what you're really telling the American people is this is endless. And Americans are beginning to say, if you have to tell us you're winning all the time, we're beginning to think you aren't. And I think that's already happening. People are saying, what are we winning? Because we're back to what's the objective? And the objective is Israel's desire to destroy Iran. Remember when we started this, we started with the notion that a little bit of regime change would provoke the resistance to stand up and overthrow the government. That went away fairly quickly. Having failed at that, what do we do next? Well, we're going to destroy their military capability. That hasn't worked. Their military capability is at least 70% of what it was before, and probably better, because they have some new weapons and new missiles they didn't have before. They continue to manufacture that material. And they have the backing of China and Russia, particularly China with its satellite connectivity, its communications, and so forth. So this is, if you have to keep saying this, it's not working. And I think that's pretty obvious. The bad news is this. we're trying to do two things at once. And this really began, I must say, under the Biden administration. This is not Trump's invention. The Biden administration started out backing this pointless and stupid and destructive war in Ukraine against Russia because it decided it was going to make the fight for the retention of American military, political, and financial hegemony in the world in Ukraine. That has failed. And then in the meantime, the war in the Middle East started up. And given its obligations to the Israel lobby and the people in the administration who were effectively agents for Israel, they had no choice but to join the war that Israel is waging on its neighbors. That then morphed into what we see today. Both wars are linked in that sense. We're not going to reverse the developments now. We're not going to stop Iran from being successful. We're not going to stop the Russians from crushing Ukraine. Those times are over. However, and this is something we got to address, and that is, if everything you do has failed, if there is nothing you can do with what you have on the table, there is a willingness to turn to something else, and that's where we go to a nuclear weapon. We're not going to use bioweapons. Bioweapons are simply uncontrollable. You have no real control over where those things go and what they do. Have as much damage to us as it will to any enemy. That's not going to be on the table. But the nuclear weapon is different. Israel has nuclear weapons, and Israel has made it very clear that it will use those if it feels it's necessary to do so. If everything else fails, I'm concerned that the Israelis will turn to something like that. And that, of course, changes everything.
Well, it does. And then I mean, you can't talk about the Russia-Ukraine war without being concerned about that on any number of fronts, possibly even ours, especially if things start going south. Marco Rubio was not just in the Middle East. He was also talking, I think, at that same forum in the Philippines. He was talking to Sergei Lavrov and talking about that. You talked about that there's no seeming movement to get out of that. Well, the official readout of that's very interesting. This is as of today. Merely says that they discussed U.S.-Russia relationships and the need to end the Russia-Ukraine war. But they didn't say anything about why. Media, on the other hand, is saying the U.S. is ready to help end the senseless war in Ukraine, but no quick deal is ahead, Rubio says. And then looking over on the Russian side, Dmitry Peskov said this about any hopes for a resolution in the near term.
In this situation, I wouldn't be overly optimistic. Contacts are indeed taking place. That is always positive. But one cannot speak of any new dynamics or acceleration right now. We continue our dialogue with the Americans through existing working channels, and we hope that when the American negotiators are freer, we will continue in person communication. They will be able to come to Moscow and continue our dialogue.
But meanwhile, like Russia has always done, they're going to continue to fight. And the air war has really stepped up. It has now expanded into the sea world. There are a number of Russian ships that have been hit in the Sea of Azov, but Russia, as they always do, strikes back harder against shipping. And now a good portion of the port system in Odessa for Ukraine has been shut down because they can't endure that. And there's all kinds of strikes along the operational depths of the front line. At the front line, Russia continues to move up. They have recently taken Konstantinivka. They're now moving up to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the last two fortress cities that are left there in the Donbass area, etc. And as you were telling me before that we came on the air here, there is another development tactically, or at least operationally, for the Russians on the battlefield. What is that?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, let's keep something in mind. Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran have all learned a very hard lesson with us. And that is that you cannot believe anything President Trump says or anything that anyone in his administration says. That's where we are right now. So there can be no arrangement, no agreement of any kind with Russia at this point on Ukraine. How many times do you meet and how many times do you listen to Donald Trump say, well, I'll do this and we'll do that and we'll hammer this out and we'll put an end to this, only to discover that he goes home, he does a 180-degree turn and does the opposite of what was said. This happened in Alaska. I think Alaska was the last serious attempt to try and reach some sort of agreement, and they've given up. That they'll be happy to talk to us or at least sit there and listen to us bloviate, but nobody trusts us. And that's very bad, because if nobody trusts us in the Middle East and nobody trusts us in Eastern Europe, you're not going to get any financiers or lenders to go back into these areas to rebuild anything, to reconstruct anything, because they don't trust anything we say, specifically when it comes to ending the conflict. They're afraid that if they go in and do anything, the next week Donald Trump will decide, well, I'm renewing the bombing campaign because I don't like X, Y, and Z. We're in a very difficult position there. Now, this man, General Surovikin, is not well known to many in the West. He should be. He's a very intelligent man, very sharp. He was instrumental in putting together the larger strategic response in Ukraine to the Ukrainian threat once they consolidated control over most of what they were initially interested in, those Russian-speaking areas. He's an Air Force officer. He understands all of the various strike systems and how to use them and how to orchestrate them. He understands the criticality of those links from intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance in the air and in space to all of those weapons platforms. He understands that we are in a world today where the strikes shape the battlefield for ground forces. In other words, the ground force doesn't wait for the strikes to lift and then move. The strikes are much more profound, much more influential. He is part of the group that has felt for some time that the war has gone too slowly, that it is being too cautious. He was harmed because of his public statements supporting Prigozhin. People will forget Prigozhin. He was the one that led this whole charge to Moscow, trying to get President Putin's attention. He's now gone the way of the buffalo. And Surovikin was punished by being sent to Africa, where he's done excellent work for the Russians in Africa. What I'm trying to say is that this is a very different personality with a different view of the battlefield and how to do things. I expect he's going to have a significant impact. And he is going to definitely finish the job up in Kharkov. And I think we will then see movement towards Odessa. And eventually, I think we will see the Ukrainians cleared completely from the area of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River. I'd be surprised if that didn't happen before long. This is not somebody who is uncertain, undecided, or what I would call extremely cautious. Quite the opposite. Now,
I wonder if you can address a little bit to kind of give us an idea of how his generalship compares to what the West is, because he's not overly cautious, but he is. It appears anyway, from what he did while he was actually actively involved, is that he is patient. Though, for example, he took decisions that nobody else in the West or Ukraine would do in 2022, when he made a calculation that to try and hold the city of Kherson, which Russian had at the time, it was going to be too costly. So he withdrew from the city, moved back across the Dnieper River, blew the 4 bridges, and that basically stopped the Ukrainians. They never went beyond that. Meanwhile, he set up these 5, what they ended up calling the 5 Surovikin lines of the defense, which were completely successful at breaking the teeth of the 2023 attack from the Ukrainian side. We can just be left to wonder what would have happened if he had remained in, because of the Prigozhin affair. He went out. Now that he's back, what does his previous attacks tell you about what he may do next?
Well, first of all, you're right. He made the correct assessment to let us and our Ukrainian proxy overreach. We overreached. 1 million casualties resulted. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost pointlessly. Think of what happened after Kursk, because when you describe Kursk, Kursk was set up initially over the objections of Stalin. Stalin wanted to attack. That's something he had in common with Hitler. They were both obsessed with attacking each other. And he was talked out of it. And I wrote a chapter in the book Margin of Victory about it, which people might want to glance at. If you look at what happened at Kursk, that's what happened to the Ukrainians. Instead of Germans, it happened to Ukrainians. Now, what you're going to see is what happened after Kursk. And what was that? Well, they moved west, but they're not going to move west the way they did initially after the fall of Stalingrad. And they're not going to move west after Kursk the way they did exactly during World War II. It'll be much more deliberate, much more methodical, but it will be devastating. And you will see an integration of air and missile power with ground combat power on a scale that you have not seen yet. That's the best I can do.
Well, that's what most in the West don't believe is even possible. In fact, many people that I've queried here in Washington, D.C. just think that, no, what we've seen Russia do since 2023, since that offensive failed and taking so-called 1.5%, whatever it's been, that's because that's all they can do, and that's all they'll ever do. So this is basically a frozen conflict. It's a stalemate, and yeah, there's lots of contact along the line, but it's not going to ever go anywhere. So we can just take our time. As a matter of fact, we saw just I guess earlier this week an announcement that Germany and UK are consorting to have this new missile defense capacity, a missile offensive capacity, to where they'll create longer range missiles for use by Ukraine into Russia up to the year 2034 is before all that stuff's going to come out. But they're thinking long term that the war is just going to continue grinding on until later on they're going to be able to hit Russia even harder. What do you think about what that number one, will that work from the European side? And secondly, whether it does or not, what is the message to Russia today that they're moving that direction?
Well, remember, you had large numbers of people that told everyone Iran will fall apart, it'll collapse after 3 or 4 days. In fact, if you go back through many of General Keene's interviews and others, they dismissed it out of hand and said, well, this will be over in a few days. Then it was a week, then it was 2 weeks. And then suddenly it was, well, this is going to take longer. Now people in Washington, believe it or not, are talking about a stalemate that could last into next year. Now, I don't see that occurring for the reasons we've already discussed. I think it'll break down before then. But this is Washington, D.C. It's a bubble. People do not live in the world of reality. They live in a fantasy world. And that fantasy world extends to Russia. Russia is still, in their minds, something that it is not, a backward, developing country that can't possibly compete with a Western military power like the United States. So when it comes to Britain and France, they are dangerously out of touch with reality. Not only can they not build any sort of air and missile defense in any time that would make any difference, that takes years and an enormous investment. And it won't work until we break the laws of fractal mathematics and relate light, gravity, and magnetism, frankly. You can create point defense and clusters, but you're not going to defend vast territories. So that's one problem. Now they want to give more weapons to Ukraine. And I think there is a real risk of two things happening. First of all, I think with Surovikin there, it may be very hard to get those missiles into the country. I think you're going to see bridges over the Dnieper, rail lines, communications lines, all destroyed, that unto now have been untouched. And we can go into, in some future point in time, what the thinking was in Moscow that left those things intact. But I think he'll go after those with a vengeance. And then the other thing is they have built up these Oreshnik missiles with conventional munitions. And I think they're prepared to use them if they have to against NATO states that are hosting construction factories, whatever you want to call them, sites for missiles. I think that's their last option, but it's real and we shouldn't dismiss it and we should be concerned about it.